So this video is going to be a little bit different than the way I typically do the video lectures. I went ahead and actually pre-programmed everything, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through the source. There's quite a bit I did ahead of time in getting this ready for the lecture, and all the source code is available up on GitHub, so please feel free to check it out. But what I did here is I went ahead and actually did a few things. I first went and implemented add new customer, and I built this form here, and this form is relevant to the lecture in covering the XML APIs within .NET. So I needed the form anyway, so I went ahead and kind of pre-built it. Part of that as well is me going in and creating the appropriate database tables. So we have a customer table now. There's a script available for that underneath the quicklypos.business data folder. There's a customer.sql which will generate that table for you if you're wanting to follow along. So we have that table in place now, and the next piece is actually making the pieces all fit together. So with XML and utilizing it within the .NET framework, I chose to use it for the purposes of populating the country and states drop-downs within the customer screen. So within here I've got text boxes for first name, last name, email address, city, state and zip, and then country, but the state and country are actually using combo boxes that drop down that include a list of all the states within the United States, as well as a list of all the countries that you can choose from. Now obviously this isn't a complete implementation. I did have a link to a different source that would give you a more complete list of countries and their appropriate states, but quite honestly for this lecture it made it so complex that it probably would have confused most people, because it was confusing me just trying to get all the pieces built out correctly. So instead of going down that road and worrying about making it so that the countries and the states all lined up correctly, I went ahead and just kind of went this route, but it's more for demonstration than for functionality, so keep that in mind. So the question becomes, how do we go ahead and take data from an XML document and actually populate something like a drop-down list like this? So let's go ahead and look through the code and see how it works. So to start off, I downloaded two documents. That's countries.xml, and this is what it looks like. So it has a root tag of countries, and then each country is identified by its own country element. And then inside of here we have two attributes. We have a code attribute and an ISO attribute, and then the name of the country is actually the text value within this country element. So this is Afghanistan, Albania, so forth. So that is the country's XML document that they were using. And then states starts out with a root element of states, and then each state has its own state element. And inside of here, everything's done with attributes. So there's a name attribute and an abbreviation attribute. And again, this is a list of all the states. So those are the two documents that we're using. Because we're using them at runtime, we're not actually compiling them into the application, I had to make some modifications within Visual Studio to make sure that those files get moved appropriately. So I'm going to right click and choose properties on this states.xml. And what I did is I toggled the copy to output directory, and I set it to copy always. And what this does is that when the application builds, after it builds all the C# code, it will actually go and take the states.xml, and I did the same thing for the countries.xml. It will go through and it will copy those files into the bin folder where the application runs. So just to kind of refresher, when you actually do a build on your application, that compiled code ends up in this bin folder. And since we're in debug mode, the debug folder is where the code, or where the compiled code goes. And then inside of here we have the countries.xml and the states.xml, as well as our exe and our DLLs. So all of that ends up inside of this folder. And by setting that always copy, the states.xml and countries.xml makes its way into the application as well. So those are all your pieces. So then it became a question of, so we have these XML documents, but we need to be able to utilize them within our application. So my approach was, under my business models, I created two lookup utilities, one for country and one for state. And they're both very similar. I'll just do a quick side-by-side here. They're both very similar to each other. The only real significant difference is which XML document they're defaulted to, and then just variable names and function names. and then additionally the descendants as to whether we were looking at the country elements or the state elements. So let's go ahead and just kind of walk through one of these to get a sense of what's going on. So I started out by creating a private string called state file name, and this is the actual file that the utility class will use when it goes to load the XML document. So I defaulted it to the name of the file, the states.xml, but I do have it set as an input parameter for my constructor, so I can pass any path to the XML document that I choose. Then when I call getAllStates, I'm returning an IEnumerable, or a collection of state objects, and the state object is something that I created, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So then internally I set up a state collection, which is just a list of state. And then this is where things get interesting. So we start out with the X document, which lives inside of system.xml.link. And what the X document does is it allows us to go in using link to be able to traverse our XML document. This is one of the newer technologies, and I found that it's very usable, very easy to use. There are some older versions that you can use things such as XPath to do parsing, or you can do straight walks of the DOM. I prefer using this method now, so I'm going to recommend and show this method, but the other two methods still work and they're still perfectly viable options. It just would have honestly taken more time to introduce and instruct on XPath and walking the full DOM. So if you ever run into that case where you do need to do something like that, there's documentation out there, or if you have a case in the future where you're curious, or if you're running into issues, feel free to ask, and I'm more than happy to walk you through that as well. So basically this first line is we're creating an X document variable called state.xml.doc. Then we're calling off of xdoc, there's a static method called load, and load will actually load in that particular file that you're working or using. So once we've loaded the XML document into the state.xml.doc, this actually becomes the parser that we'll use to parse the XML. And what we do here then is we can use the descendants method, which will return us a collection of what are called X elements. And basically X element is just a wrapper class for going in and pulling out elements from the XML document. So we get back all of the XML elements called state. Let me just pull up the original document side by side so you can get a sense of what's happening here. So each one of these state elements will get picked up and then provided to us as basically a collection that we can loop through. And then we're going to loop through each one of these states one at a time. And we're going to create our own state object, and then I'm passing in that XML element into my state object, and I'm doing the parsing or pulling the values into my own object, and then I'm adding that to my collection, and then I'm eventually returning my collection. So the process here isn't too terribly intensive. We could have simplified this by simply working with the XML documents in X elements, but it's actually, you end up kind of with a separation of concerns where you start to build those layers of saying, well, right now the data is coming from an XML document, but in the future we could replace it with a database with these values and then just make changes to this method, and nobody would be any the wiser in terms of the rest of the application knowing where this data is coming from. It just deals with those state objects every time. So let's look at how the X element gets parsed into a state object. So the state is a class, and it has a constructor that takes in that X element. There's two properties in here, name and abbreviation. And then inside of the constructor, I'm doing the parsing process. So I'm checking to say, is the XML state actually defined? If it's null, then I throw a argument null exception. And then in terms of pulling the values out, you have to consider that this XML state is basically one of these lines. So then I look at it and I say, get me the attribute called name, and then I take the value of that attribute, which in this first line here would be Alabama, and then I take the same thing and I do XML state element, take the attribute abbreviation, and then grab that value. So that would grab the abbreviation of AL and store it in this property. And that is how we populate the state object. So then once that new state object is instantiated, we can go ahead then and then add it to the collection and then return that collection. So let's go ahead and jump to the country lookup and we'll look at that as well. It's very similar in implementation. So we have the countries.xml document. We have our country file path. The constructor takes in that path to XML. I create a new list of country, take my xdoc, create a country XML doc, load that country file name into the doc. And then I take the XML doc of countries and then grab all of the descendants. So let me pull up side by side the countries.xml. So I grab all the country elements, put that in a collection, and then I loop over that collection and I create a new instance of my own country object. And that country object has three properties, has a code, a name, and an ISO value. So again, we have a code and an ISO, which is the two attributes of the country, and then the name of the country itself is actually the value within the country element. So it changes up things a little bit. So the ISO is an integer, so we have to do a convert to int32, taking in this value, which is a string. So we take the XML country, grab the ISO attribute, take its value, convert it to an integer, and store it. XML country attribute, grab the code, and then take its value. And then the last part is the XML country element itself, which is basically this line. We're grabbing the value of that element, which is this text inside of the tags. So that will be stored in name. So that's how we populate the country object. And then again, we add the new object to the collection and then return that collection. So all of that being said, it's not the process isn't overly sophisticated. It's really just a matter of taking data from one place and putting it somewhere else. So where things start to get interesting is actually looking at the routine for the insert update customer form. So this form has text boxes and list boxes, or combo boxes, as I said before. So let's go ahead and look at the code of this and see how this all fits together. So I designed this form to be able to do an insert and update mode. So I created an enum value called insert update customer form mode. That's defined here at the bottom of the form. So it's public enum insert update customer form mode, and I basically listed the two modes of insert and update. So I'm tracking that, and then I'm also tracking the current customer ID of the customer that I'm working on within the form. This is the default constructor, and it calls initialize components by default. I go ahead and set the customer form mode to insert, because if no customer is being passed in, then I must be in a insert mode. I also have a mode where I can then pass in the customer. It calls the constructor list parameter, which would execute this code here. And then I call load customer, passing the customer object. So load customer is a method that I created. So scrolling down further is load customer. Inside of here, I take in that customer, set the customer form mode to update, grab the customer ID from the customer object. I then initialize the state and country. I set the state and country from the customer object, so these are both strings. And I take that value and I set it to the appropriate drop-down list value. And then I grab the text out of the remaining fields and put them in the appropriate text box. So when the form loads, I check to see if it's an insert mode. If it is an insert mode, I still need to initialize that state and country. If it's not an insert mode, then I don't need to worry about it because it's going to be handled by the constructor. The button save does similar work where it checks to see if we're in insert mode, or else it'll perform an update. So if we're in insert, it performs the insert. This is a method that I wrote. I have a small message box that says that the process was completed successfully, and then it closes the form. Else, if it's in update mode, then I perform an update. Again, a similar message to say that things were updated, and then I close the form. And then I have a simple try catch to say if an exception occurs, then I just output the message of the exception. So the perform insert is a fairly straightforward piece. I did create a DB customer utility. I won't go into full detail on that, but the code is available. And basically I implemented 4 methods. I have a get customer, which returns all customers, get customer by customer ID, update customer, create customer, and delete customer. So I guess it's really 5. And then I have a private method to build the customer. So similar process that we took for when we built the products or inventory utility prior. So that is the utility for customers. Again, it's doing much the same work as we did with the inventory utility. It's simply doing a select all from customer this time. So when we're performing an insert, we basically create a new customer object, pulling those values. The new customer also gets set with a country and state, and then we send that new customer to the customer utility to create the customer. The perform update is very similar. Create an instance of the utility. We go and we get the customer by the customer ID that we pulled from above, and then we make sure that we got back a customer object, and then we set all the values, and then we update the customer object in the database. So this should look pretty straightforward. I'm following pretty much the same conventions as we followed in the past, so there should be nothing new here. The code may be a little more concise, and that's simply because I'm just working to try to perform all the different cases inside of this one form instead of building separate forms. So the piece that's probably of most interest is actually the piece that's hidden here, which is under the combo box helpers region. So I'm going to expand this, and you'll see that I've got some additional methods set. So I've got 4 methods. I got set country, where I pass in the country as a string, and I set that within the combo box. Set state does the same thing for the state combo box. And then the part that's probably of most interest is the initializers. So inside of initialize country, I create an instance of the country lookup utility, and I pass in the path to the XML document. So currently it's just going to be at the root wherever the bin directory is. Instead of overriding the toString, as I've done in the past, I go ahead and actually use the value member and display member properties of the combo box, and I say that it should use the name property off of the country object. And then I set the data source to countryutil.getAllCountries. So basically what happens here is I'm grabbing all the countries as a collection, and I'm setting my data source to that collection of countries. Initialize state does much the same thing. State lookup, looking at states.xml. I set my display member and value members both to the name property. And then I set the data source for that state combo box to grab all states from the state utility, returns that collection, sets that as the data source, and then loads my dropdown. So when this all runs, and we go customer, add new customer, we're basically creating a new customer at this point, and then the states from our XML document populate our collection of state objects. Those then get bound here, and then what we're seeing here is the name property from each one of those states. Same way country is doing the same thing. We pull all the countries from the country.xml, and we get a list of all the countries within that document. Now just to show how that's working and that it's even running dynamically, I will go in here and I will open this file, and I will change Ohio to be Ohio's, plural, and save it. I'll then jump back to my program that's currently running, choose add customer, scroll down here, and it's not going to reflect the change because this is the file within the project itself, not the file that's located within the bin folder. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that and save, and we'll close that file. And instead what I'll do is I'll right click, open the folder in the File Explorer, jump into the bin folder, debug, and then I'll open up states here. I'll make this Ohio's and save. So now let me close that and add customer again and scroll down, and there's Ohio's with an S. So that data from our XML is populating our drop-down list. So again, you could have watched me code all that, but I felt like it was probably easier just for you to have a walkthrough of that code and experience it for yourself. You're welcome to utilize these XML documents in your own project if you find them useful. They'll be available for you up on my GitHub repository. The source code that I'm using as well is available. So if you want to utilize it or some version of it in your project, I'm perfectly fine with that as well, but hopefully you understand what's happening here and how all of this works. If you do have questions, obviously, as always, feel free to ask, and I'll be happy to help you with it.